They said he was just another shuffling old man with a discount card and too much time, at least. That's what the woman behind him muttered as she watched him count out his change, slow and steady, like he was handling something sacred. Her voice wasn't angry, just bored and biting. Jesus, this isn't a museum, Grandpa. Pick up the pace. She didn't know that the man in front of her, shoulders bent and hands shaking slightly as he folded a few worn bills into the machine. One stood on the deck of a destroyer while missiles screamed overhead and the sea burned black around him. She didn't know that the beat-up Navy cap he wore wasn't bought online, but handed to him by a sailor he'd pulled from a burning helicopter who never got the chance to wear it himself. To her, he was just an obstacle in the self-checkout lane, just an old man in a too-big coat who held up the line. And she would have kept thinking that, kept laughing with her Bluetooth in her ear and half a smile on her phone screen, until someone finally opened the sealed box sitting at the foot of his bed 2 days later, after he passed away quietly in his sleep. Inside, medals older than most of the staff, citations signed in ink by hands now buried in Arlington, and a folded letter, official, yellowed, and unmistakably marked, from a rear admiral who called him Mentor, Protector. And the reason any of us made it home. But that was 2 days later. This story, the one that changes everything, happened before the world remembered him. Before anyone knew his name. It happened in aisle 6 of a quiet grocery store, the kind with dusty linoleum and an old cooler that buzzed just a bit too loud. And if you agree that respect should never be an afterthought, that some battles are still fought long after the war ends, then like this video and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The morning Harold Keene walked into Davidson's Market. He did so the same way he had for the last 10 years, quietly, before the rush, before the kids came in yelling, and the staff stopped pretending to care. He wore a navy blue windbreaker zipped up to his chest and pressed slacks he'd ironed himself. His white hair, thin but combed with precision, sat neatly beneath that navy cap, the one with a patch that read USS McAllister, CVN, 74. He moved slowly, sure-footed but deliberate, with a small shopping list folded and refolded in his shirt pocket, written in block letters only he could understand. People didn't look at him twice. They rarely did. The cashier, Abby, offered her usual soft smile. She liked Mr. Keene, though she didn't know why, and he returned it with a slow nod. But she was stocking dairy when it happened, and she didn't see the moment it all shifted. It started near the self-checkout, where Harold was trying to scan a can of split-pea soup, the good kind, the one he always bought when the weather dipped below 60. He fumbled slightly, and it slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor with a hollow metal thud. That's when she sighed. The woman behind him, late 20s maybe, sharp-tongued and sharper dressed, holding a $6 smoothie and 2 boxes of protein bars like she was in a hurry to post about them. Unbelievable, she muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Every damn time. Can we please stop letting World War I reenactors hold up the line? A few heads turned. Someone chuckled. Harold didn't. He bent down to retrieve the can, fingers slow but steady, and stood again without meeting her eyes. Of course, it's Navy, she added, nodding toward his cap. Do you guys even fight? Or do you just float around and take credit? This time, the chuckle came from another line. Harold said nothing. His silence wasn't shame, it was habit. The kind you learn when speaking only makes things worse. But someone else did speak. From behind the cold brew display, a voice rang out, low, clear, and clipped with authority. Lieutenant Commander Keene? Everyone turned. A woman stepped forward, tall, precise, and unmistakably military. Her uniform was flawless. Rear Admiral Sarah Holt. Her chest bore rows of color, service, and sacrifice. And her eyes? They locked straight onto Harold with the kind of reverence that silences even the most arrogant tongues. It's really you, she said, her voice softer now. Sir, I never forgot what you did. You saved all of us that night. Harold blinked, confused for half a second, then smiled, just a flicker. She stepped forward and, without hesitation, raised her hand and saluted him. Sharp. Formal. The air went still. The smoothie woman's mouth fell open. No one moved. No one breathed. Harold returned the salute, slower, with a hand that trembled from time, not uncertainty. And then she added, this man led sailors through fire, through storm, and through war. He's the reason I'm here. And the reason more than 50 of us made it home. The grocery store had never been so quiet. Even the cooler stopped buzzing. The girl at the register froze halfway through a scan. And the woman with the smoothie? She just stared, her world collapsing in on a truth she never bothered to imagine. Because she hadn't mocked a nobody. She hadn't mocked some grandpa with a story. She'd mocked a man who carried more history in his silence than she had in her entire digital feed. The Admiral turned to her, not cruel, just firm. Apologize. And she did. Quietly. Red-faced. Words sticking in her throat. Harold didn't need her apology, but he accepted it anyway. Because dignity doesn't demand humiliation, it simply waits for the truth to speak. And that day, aisle 6 became more than a checkout lane. It became a place where legacy stood tall again, shoulders back, head on, remembered. The apology came out soft, barely more than a stammer, but it was too late to stop the shift in the room. The air had changed, charged now with something old and heavy, recognition. Harold Keene, who had entered that store anonymous and ordinary, now stood beneath the weight of reverence, surrounded by eyes that suddenly looked different. It wasn't just Admiral Holt's presence that changed things, it was the way she looked at him, like a daughter might look at a father who had come home from a war nobody knew he'd fought. She moved beside him then, respectfully but purposefully, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You probably don't remember me, sir. USS Gallagher. South Sea Intercept, 1981. I was just a petty officer. You ordered a countermove that saved my division. I've been carrying a copy of your final broadcast orders in my jacket pocket for 20 years. Your voice was the last one I heard before the evac." Harold blinked, lips parting slightly, not in surprise but in quiet recall. "Gallagher," he whispered, and Holt nodded with a small, stunned smile, like hearing her ship's name spoken aloud by the man who had once saved it was worth more than any ribbon on her uniform. People were watching now, customers, staff, a delivery driver who had stopped halfway through loading crates and didn't realize he'd set one down on his foot. The young man who had been bagging groceries near the end of the line, barely old enough to shave, stood frozen, eyes wide, one hand resting over the name tag on his chest like it might help him steady the gravity of what he was witnessing. Admiral Holt didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "This man," she said, turning to the growing crowd, was awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, 3 Silver Stars, and oversaw covert operations that still don't appear in declassified files. He trained 2 generations of leaders. He walked through fire so we wouldn't have to. And today, he stood in front of a self-checkout scanner while people laughed at the time it took him to count change. No one spoke. Not even the store manager, who had finally come out of his office, halfway through adjusting his name tag, only to freeze when he saw the rear admiral standing beneath the fluorescent aisle lights like a monument in dress blues. "You didn't just mock a vet," Holt continued, her voice not angry, just disappointed. "You mocked a man who wrote the pages of the freedom you stand on." And now the woman with the smoothie couldn't look up. She stood rooted in place, her pride stripped clean by truth and rank, and the sound of her own cruelty echoing back in her ears. Harold didn't gloat. He didn't speak. His silence had always been stronger than the loudest accusation. Instead, he held his gaze forward, eyes soft but unflinching, like he was still standing on the deck of something larger, still reading the wind. Admiral Holt turned to the store manager now, her voice clipped. "I trust your team will be reviewing how to treat veterans in the future." The manager nodded quickly, words caught in his throat. Yes, ma'am. Of course." Harold finally looked at the woman beside him and said gently, "You never stop standing post, do you?" Holt smiled. "Not when it's for you, sir." Just then, the young grocery clerk, his name was Aiden, took 2 hesitant steps forward and, with trembling hands, extended a pack of canned soup. "Sir," he said, voice cracking slightly, "I think you dropped this earlier." Harold accepted it, nodding once, then added, "My dad used to bring this back from the base. Said it tasted like duty and warm socks." Aiden gave a soft laugh, unsure if he was allowed to. Then he cleared his throat. "My uncle was Navy. Maybe you knew him? Lieutenant Gavin Reese?" Harold thought a moment, then smiled. "Good man. Always check the engines twice." Aiden blinked, visibly shaken. "You did know him. You never forget the ones who stay late to keep others safe," Harold replied. That was the moment the energy in the room shifted for good. It wasn't just about admiralty and honor anymore. It was about presence. About history walking quietly beside us, disguised as the man in line behind you. An elderly woman near the freezer section turned to her daughter and whispered, "That's why your grandfather always stood for the anthem." A construction worker waiting to pay for a Gatorade removed his hard hat. Even a toddler near the pharmacy grew quiet as her father gently hushed her, eyes locked on the veteran in aisle 6. Holt stepped back slightly, not out of distance but deference, and allowed Harold the space to finish his purchase. Aiden offered to bag it for him, even tried to carry it, but Harold shook his head. "I've carried heavier," he said kindly. This one's just got dinner in it." And then he turned to leave, not in a hurry, but with the same steady pace that once led men through combat zones without losing a single soul. Admiral Holt followed into the door, not in command, but in step. They didn't need to speak anymore. The crowd parted around them, no applause, just awareness, and Harold paused before exiting. "Thank you," he said to no one in particular, or maybe to all of them, "for listening. That's all I ever needed." And as the door swung open, spilling golden morning light across the linoleum, someone whispered, "He was always more than we saw." Admiral Holt looked back at the store one last time, then at the people standing still in reverence. "The best ones usually are," she said. And then they were gone. They say the store felt different for days afterward, not just in the way people talked softer near the checkout lanes or how the smoothie aisle stayed strangely quiet, but in the kind of stillness that settles only when truth has passed through a place and left it changed. It wasn't just what Harold Keene did that morning, or what Admiral Holt revealed. It was what everyone else realized when they saw him walk through the automatic doors, bag in one hand, dignity in the other. For the first time in years, people noticed him. Not just him, but what he stood for, the whole generation who quietly folded into the background, holding doorways open with hands that once held rifles, counting coupons with fingers that once signed orders in war zones. And though Harold never came back to that grocery store again, though he passed away just 48 hours later in a sleep, in a quiet VA hospice bed facing the sunrise, his impact remained, not as a headline, but as a memory passed by whispers and nods. Because when the coroner cleared his room, they found a sealed cedar shadow box at the foot of his bed, untouched since 1972. Inside it, folded dress whites preserved so perfectly they still held the crease of inspection day. A row of medals arranged with mathematical precision, including a Navy Cross, a Distinguished Service Medal, and one that no one in the room could identify without searching naval archives. There was a worn black and white photo of a much younger Admiral Holt, smiling beneath a torn American flag on a Storm Rock deck, and beneath it, a signed letter addressed to L.C. Keene from a 4-star admiral that read, "You were the spine when we had none. I owe you my life, and the Navy owes you far more than they remember." The hospice nurse who had once joked that he was probably just an old man who watched too many war movies didn't say a word as the funeral detail arrived. She just stood in silence as they folded the flag over his coffin, tears streaming down her cheeks. But the story didn't end there. Because word of what happened in Aisle 6 reached more than just the staff at Davidson's Market. It reached the local VFW, the nearby naval base, and eventually, Rear Admiral Holt's office at the Pentagon. And 3 weeks later, in a modest town square where Harold used to sit and feed birds without anyone noticing, a quiet ceremony was held. There was no ribbon cutting, no press, just a podium, a plaque, and a crowd that had grown larger than anyone expected. Admiral Holt stood before them in her full dress blues, her voice calm but resolute. "We walk past heroes every day. They hold the door. They sweep the floors. They wait patiently while we rush by. But respect isn't about rank, it's about remembrance." She gestured to the plaque beside her, freshly mounted into a polished stone base beneath the flag. It read, "Lieutenant Commander Harold Keene, Valor in Silence, Legacy in Action." The store clerk, Aiden, was there too, tie crooked, part full, clutching a letter Harold had mailed to him in those final hours before passing. Inside it, a hand-drawn map of the store's layout with a single sentence scrawled beneath, "You noticed. That's where change begins." And somewhere in that crowd stood the woman with the smoothie. No one pushed her forward, no one needed to. She stood near the back, her hands clasped, sunglasses hiding the eyes that wouldn't stop blinking back the weight of her own lesson. She hadn't spoken publicly since that day, hadn't posted on social media, hadn't even stepped foot in Davidson's. But today she came. And when Admiral Holt stepped down from the podium and began to walk the line of attendees, she paused in front of her, not to scold, not to shame, but to say one line, "You listen when it mattered." That's how we carry him forward. Afterward, Aiden placed a small dog tag, found in the bottom of Harold's shopping bag, inside a shadow box beside the plaque. Not for tourists. Not for show. Just for those who paused long enough to care. Over time, the plaque became a quiet tradition. Veterans would stop there on their walks. Students from the local high school would leave handwritten essays about Harold's story on Memorial Day. A small bench was added, then a flower box. But it wasn't until a young naval recruit, only a few weeks from deployment, sat on that bench one crisp October morning and whispered to no one in particular, "I hope I carry it like he did." That someone realized Harold's story had already become something more. It had become a mirror, not one of glory, but of choice. A reminder that you don't have to wear medals on your chest to carry history in your posture. That silence doesn't mean absence. That legacy isn't loud, it's steady. And for those who still rush through lines, judging by speed or appearance, there's a story waiting in aisle 6. A story about a man who said nothing while he was mocked, who walked slowly so the rest of us could learn to see more clearly. A man who never asked for recognition, but still taught an entire town, and eventually a nation, what honor really looks like. So no, Harold Keene never made headlines. He never went viral. He never told people what he'd done. But he didn't have to. Because one moment of truth, one salute, one grocery store on a quiet Tuesday morning, was enough to echo forever.